Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on philosophy of online education. My name is Ria, and I am a teacher and a research associate at Nirman. I will be moderating today's session. I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. Today is our first lecture on the No Lockdown on Learning lecture series. We have gotten a great response with participants joining from more than 50 cities in India and 5 different countries. A lot of our participants are teachers, parents, teacher trainers, researchers, and ex-students from our school, Vidyashram, the South Point School. And it makes me just very happy to see such a diverse participant list over here. Let's begin today's lecture with some introductions about Nirman and our director, Professor Neeta Kumar, who will be taking today's session. Nirman is a not-for-profit organization based out of Varanasi district in India. We work in the Varanasi city as well as 12 adjoining villages in the district. Nirman was started in 1990, and this is our 30th year of working in the field of education, arts, and research. I've been a part of Nirman in the last year, and what brought me to Nirman was their philosophy and belief in academic work being coupled with groundwork, and the fact that all their education practices are research oriented. We run an innovative school called the Vidyashram, the South Point School. We have two campuses, one in the city and in the village, in Betawar village. Ours is an integrated school where we have students from diverse backgrounds in all classrooms, students from the families of farmers, weavers, daily wage workers, businessmen, entrepreneurs, uh, educators, researchers, and more are all part of our school. We also run an artist studio. We collaborate with artists from all over the world on different backgrounds of music, visual arts, martial arts, theater. Our school calendars are filled with projects of these artists and programs throughout the year, where our students also equally participate in these projects. Lastly, we also run the Center of Post-Colonial Education, which is a research wing. We host study abroad students from universities around the world and invite collaboration from educators and artists in different fields. With the current COVID-19 crisis upon all of us, a lot of our work has been affected, including our school classes to all our research projects. We are trying to shift things online. We are trying to navigate through these times in order for us to sustain ourselves, as well as in order to sustain through this crisis, as well as sustain our children and our staff members. We have started a fundraiser on Milap to get through these months. Please consider making a donation in your capacity. The link of the fundraiser will be shared in the chat box at the end of the session. You can also ask me questions related to the fundraiser as and when you would like. And now I would like to introduce Neeta ma'am, as she is known to all of us over here. She completed her PhD from the University of Chicago. Her fields of research have been in the history of modern India, anthropology, as well as Russian and European history. She has taught at the University of Chicago, Brown University, and the University of Michigan, amongst other places. And mainly, she is the founder and director of Nirman. For the past 30 years, she has taught written curricula, trained teachers, worked on children's books and arts projects. At Nirman, she's working with her in the past year. I have realized that she strives to make education accessible to everyone around here, and that is what makes it very interesting to work with her. She's written multiple books and research papers and presented her research at a lot of platforms. If I continue talking and listing all of them out, I will have to speak for much longer. So instead, if someone is interested in learning more about her work, please let me know and I will send her 8-page resume to you, and you can look through it at your own pace. I would now like to invite Neeta ma'am to start today's lecture and introduce today's lecture of the philosophy of online education. We will have a question and answer round at the end. So please drop your questions in the chat box at any time. Once her talk is over, we will be going to the question and answer round. Neeta ma'am, please start the session.
Thank you, Ria. Can you hear me? Am I all
Yes.
audible and everything? Yeah. Welcome, everyone. I am so grateful to you all to want to join into this meeting. And I hope we'll have a robust question and answer session at the end. I, of course, am full of things to say, and I'll be sharing them all with you. But I'm really looking forward to your questions and interaction with you as well. So let me plunge right into my topic, which is threefold. It's about the philosophy of education. It's about the present COVID-19 crisis. And then actually what's not in the title, it's a lot about the inflection we must give to these things because of our location in India. And I'm someone, as a historian and anthropologist, who is very particular about being actually in touch with all the developments in our history, society, culture, religion, and politics. So I'm going to be bringing in India a lot in my discussion of both curriculum and the COVID-19 crisis. Let me begin with a little story. You've heard about our school. So we have this school which is based on the philosophy of integration, which means that children are regarded all as one and they could come from any background and get the same treatment. So we were way ahead of the RTE Act and so on, which is very welcome if it works out. And the other part of our philosophy was excellence, the pursuit of excellence. So we were recognized as a change maker school by Ashoka International. But apart from that, right from the beginning, we have tried very much to be what's called a progressive school, which is child-centered, innovative, and gives a lot of attention to the individual child's needs and levels of learning. Now, fast forward to March 2020, and schools are shut very abruptly in the middle of March. So what do? We took a week at least to come to terms with it, had a few meetings, discussed various proposals and alternatives. And then we decided to give ourselves another couple of weeks to prepare. So we wound up with whatever we were doing in terms of evaluations and homework and so on. And then we started planning for online classes. Now that's a very tall order. And I'm so glad you're here to share it with me because I'm going to say a lot about this. What does it mean for a school to suddenly have online classes? Well, the very first thing is to try to make a timetable because classes are classes and when are you going to hold them? Timetables are a problem because you need a device for this online teaching thing which has started. And in many families, there is one device which is really smart and can be shared. And there may be siblings who are trying to share it. There may be a father going off to work with it. And of course, there could be another parent, mother, or whoever who also needs that same device. So the timetable is not easy. And then for a teacher to have to teach the same number of classes is actually impossible. The maximum a teacher can actually handle is 3 or 4. And even that has to be staggered so that the time is sufficient for people to join in, just like happened just now at the meeting. It's always 5 or 10 minutes extra. And then the response and feedback which comes from the children also has to be planned for. So teachers suddenly have this new burden. And I haven't even mentioned yet the whole idea of online teaching. So you have to plan somehow to do what we are all doing right now, to become tuned in to each other, to plug in things, put in earphones, put in our mics, and then plan what are we going to say, how will we be visible, will we be audible, who is going to listen, how are they going to respond. It's a whole new world out there. Many, many schools, including us, have been doing many versions of online work and using the internet, using technology, using the screen. But no one, I think it goes without saying, has done it to the extent at which it is demanded now. So we had to plunge in to a lot of work, and some of the discussions that ensued among our teachers were really interesting. For instance, the teacher whom I thought was the most savvy in presenting herself on stage and before a mic suddenly confessed that it's really terrifying to face the mic and make a video of herself, which is for her children, and so on. So we all polished those arts. I'm sure many of us in private rehearsed them and so on, went through many versions before we took the risk of ever appearing in public before anyone. And we had to really think about each class, each subject, and so on. Now, if our school's curriculum is a certain kind of curriculum, we can only work with that, can't we? We're not going to come up overnight with a new curriculum. So let me tell you what happens with that kind of thing with regard to our own school as a model. So in our school, we have a kind of combination of three kinds of curriculum. One is what's called the classical curriculum, or the idealistic curriculum, which is the old-fashioned one, where you have certain classics, hence the name, which have to be studied, a certain fund or core of global knowledge that has to be mastered. And there are set areas of skills and levels that have to be completed within every subject area. That's what's classical in a curriculum. Then the second kind of curriculum we also use is the progressive curriculum, where you do not rely on predefined areas of skills and knowledge, but you go rather by the level of development demonstrated by each child. And so you make the curriculum in tandem with the child, depending on the questions that seem to be of most importance to that, important to that child. And you move on from there step by step, keeping to the pace of development of the child. And the third kind of curriculum that we have in our school is, has a name coined by us. It's called the post-colonial curriculum. I'll get into all these a bit later in the talk, but in a nutshell, what that means is to be very aware of our own society as being part of a certain history, which means our society does have many hierarchies and many divisions, class, caste, political, religious, what have you. And it behooves us to teach children how to think critically about this, to reflect on themselves and their position in this society, and hopefully to be able to reflect on all this so comfortably and become so adept analytically that they can actually then move on to the next step of being able to do something about it. Now, how do we adapt this school's curriculum to online teaching? And if I tell you our experience, maybe you can do the same with whatever it is that you are going to do with your own school's teaching. So let's take one at a time. Using the classical curriculum means actually to make worksheets with things which are familiar to everyone. That means if it's maths, then it's many sums to complete. If it's science, it's problems to solve. If it's social studies, it's comprehension, questions, a little bit of project work. If it's language, it's more comprehension, giving stories and asking questions about them. These are all familiar processes in the classroom. And they're the same processes that can be adapted to online teaching. All you have to do is to mind your punctuation, basically. After you write it, you have to read it over and make sure that it still makes sense. There's that old joke, right? Like a comma can change everything. Well, it's not true when you have a physical classroom, but it's true when you do things online. The second kind of curriculum, the progressive curriculum, means that you give children different kinds of projects and keep it very open-ended. There's no one correct answer. You're going to ask them to do things to the best of their ability, to the best of their understanding. If you say, make a list of 10 utensils in your kitchen, then you don't know which 10 utensils they will write. And if they write, say, pot, and you wanted them to write a different word for whatever it is they're trying to say and draw, so be it. You can't actually correct them because you ask them such an open-ended thing. They're going to respond to it only at their own level, and so on. So there are many, many kinds of activities like that, projects and patterns and things to resolve and analyze and research and so on, and to present. And the third kind is very difficult to adapt to online teaching. I would go so far as to say that because it is difficult, I'm not very comfortable with actually speaking as an expert yet on the subject. I would say that we have I'm myself, as someone who is teaching history in class 10, trying to figure out which is the best way to actually make children, for example, comfortable with thinking critically about nationalism or democracy without being able to interact with them and have a kind of give and take at every step of the discussion. There is a tendency, which we have to take seriously, for all of us, adults, that is teachers and educators and parents and so on, and children, that is students, to fall back into the default mode of the classical curriculum. We all actually like authority, we like structure, we like rules. And the progressive curriculum tends to seem relatively unstructured, relatively free and easy and without rules, where much more space is given to the children. And therefore, in times of change, like the present times, in times of a new kind of challenge, the default, as I said, is to fall back and say, please just tell me what's the question. And after I've replied to it, please just tell me if it's correct or not. Everyone wants a good, solid question and a correct answer, yes or no, tick mark or cross. So we have to worry about that a little bit. Okay, I'm going to tell you another story so that we can reflect more and better on the curriculum issue. It's the story of a well-educated, young, honest, liberal person setting out to do education on schools in North India, specifically Uttar Pradesh, starting in Lucknow, going through many towns and ending up in detail in Banaras or Varanasi. Yes, that person is me. So let me shift to the first person. What I found in my research was actually very shocking. And the conditions which were revealed to me are what I've described as nightmarish. It seemed that across the board, all kinds of schools, whether they were very old or very new, very large or very small, whatever medium they were, and we had already English, Hindi, Sanskrit, Urdu, Bengali, etc. And whatever kind of ideology they were based on, whoever their founder was, all kinds of schools had a very dismal, unreflective level of dealing with their children. First of all, the educators were not even able to articulate what their curriculum was, what their philosophy was, what it is that they were trying to teach. And the few who could, who are usually the better known names, such as, say, Krishnamurti, Annie Besant, Montessori, with those exceptions, all the rest were floundering. And very often I had to supply it to them in the research. But the point is that we are not, as a society, able to articulate our own philosophy of education and the kind of philosophical base to our curriculum which we are working with. And that's not to say we are not working with it. All of us have a philosophy, and all of us are very clear about our ideas of childhood, children, learning, teaching, etc. We just don't know how to put it in words. So the next part of the story is that after this research, which revealed many, many very problematic areas in education, together with the team and group of people, I was instrumental in our setting up our school. And of course, that school had to be a progressive one. It very deliberately and consciously adopted a progressive philosophy. Now, I would go so far as to say that most, if not all, trained teachers in India are products of this kind of philosophy. In their training, this is what they have encountered: to think of the child as an individual, to think of the levels of development of the child, to think of age-appropriate teaching. They have been exposed to the ideas of some of the main philosophers of this ism. I'm just going to mention two. This is not the real topic, and we could go on for a long time. I want to mention John Dewey from America and Jean Piaget from Switzerland. And of course, their ideas are based on centuries of European philosophy, dating from the Enlightenment times, Rousseau, and so on. But these two were instrumental in being extremely influential, so that in the Euro-American world, at least, these ideas have been taken as the normal ideas of education. And there's almost no school which is different to this skeleton structure of progressivism. And what that means is, what we have also adopted in India, is that teachers have to worry about how to teach something which seems to be in conflict with what the child is able to learn. And the usual way we resolve this is by still negating that training which we have received and pushing ahead to either blaming the child's background, blaming the child's community, or some unknown factors which we are not able to pinpoint. In our school, we do take progressivism very seriously. And here is what I've learned from our own experience. There is actually a difference in children. And that difference is not an innate difference. Indeed, according to the progressive model, which is a developmental model, a cognitive developmental model, every child has some kind of an innate level of development which they are evolving with, and therefore they are evolving at their own pace. According to that model, there is an intrinsic kind of mysteriousness to the child. According to the model which I propose that we should rather have, there is an openness to the child. Yes, the child has an individual sensibility and therefore rate of progress, but that is not singular. There is more than one thing going on within the child. The child is fluid, the child is multiple, the child is both able to do something and also faltering at it. The child is very incompetent at something. It seems to be beyond their level. But they're also yearning to do it. They're also struggling to do it. They're also looking for help in doing it. So these complex multiplicities have to be taken carefully into account. And the developmental model does not, because it claims to be a kind of science. There is a lot of criticism of this model, especially in America. And I've done research in American schools, which revealed to me the problem. And that is simply one, that there is a kind of extremism in their practice. The teacher is curiously inhibited and disempowered. She is curiously timid in trying to decide what is the level or criterion of skill she wants to require of the child. She holds back, worried that she might trespass on the space of the child. And almost every effort made by the student tends to be rewarded equally. Now, these are all problematic things as I saw them in my research. And as I pondered on it, it seemed to me that what is missing here is giving the child that kind of recognition that they are also struggling to recognize themselves. They're not already completed works. They're very much works in progress. I want to introduce the idea of the Indian philosophy. And that's the link to make to the present times of COVID-19. Now, it's a very tricky territory, because as soon as you say India, you seem to be opening the floodgates to visions of a very classical, beautiful, idyllic, ancient past, where everything was golden and honey-flavored or whatever. And we could already split the atom, and we could already fly, and what had we not achieved? So I don't mean that kind of India. I mean the actual practice of Indian education, which is documentable, both in texts and through oral traditions. Where are these oral traditions? Well, in the realm of the arts, for example, in the realm of music and dance, they are still alive and well, our traditions of education. And in a nutshell, the idea of it is that a child is not predictable. Actually, any child can achieve anything. It's up to at least two different, let's say, kinds of efforts. One is of the child, how hard they labor, how hard they work, riyaz as it's called in music. And the other is of the teacher, how committed are they, how much are they going to give to this teaching exercise. But if those two things go right, then actually a child can be totally transformed. You could not predict at a certain age what that child's level is, or how are they going to progress, or where are they going to reach. It's all a little bit debatable, it's all controversial. I've had lots of debates and interesting Q&As at the end of my talks with people who really thought some people can write, some can draw, what are you saying? And what I'm saying is, actually we don't know who can write and who can draw. You know, we don't know who can sing, we don't know who can fly, we don't know who can pray, we don't know who can compose something. And let us try to figure it out together with the child by actually enabling them to learn things which they might seem resistant to. I'm saying that you might have to impose on what seems to be the level of the child or the territory of the child. So here we come back to the synthesis that I'm saying, the combination of a very progressive curriculum, which I totally believe in, but I am also very aware of the critical things we can bring to it, and a synthesis of this, and a truly classical curriculum where there is this body of knowledge, which, you know what, some parts of our society, some children of certain backgrounds, classes, families, not divided by just poor and rich at all, but very often because of the professions of the parents, their preoccupations with their own lives and so on. Very often because of lots of circumstances. Because of all that, there is a division in what the child has access to. And it is the job of the teacher to make all kinds of children have an access to all kinds of learning. So in COVID-19 times, the curriculum which we make, the philosophy which we adopt for online teaching should very deliberately have a huge classical element to it, in which we ask them to read a lot, to ponder on it a lot, to learn whole poems and pieces of lyrical prose by heart. Yes, I think by heart is a great thing to do in COVID-19 times, and to actually recite it for themselves or their family members. Now, here is the thing. There is a very unfortunate dichotomy which we sometimes recite. Whether we accept it or not is another matter, but we speak it as if we believe it. And that is between good teaching as being child-centered and therefore progressive, and bad teaching as being that old-fashioned kind of teaching which includes rote learning and using textbooks. And this is a false dichotomy. You could have rote learning, which is very creative, very, very satisfying to the child, and indeed full of self-development for the child. And you could have some kind of a project that seems an imposition to the child. It's just come from the top down, collect this trash, now analyze this trash, now what is going to happen to this trash? And the child couldn't care less. So it's not really that the old-fashioned kind is mechanical, boring, and harsh, and the new kind of teaching is all very great and creative. It's that you have to have a very sensitive combination of the two. Here are some difficult questions for us to answer. What kind of sensitivity am I talking about? So in the times of COVID-19, here is an opportunity. Here are certain opportunities. The first one is that although teachers are all necessarily more burdened, they have to do extra work and they all feel the pressure of it. Actually, they have a little time to think about what they're going to teach and how, better than they had when there was a rush of appearing at a certain time, all dressed up and ready, which they don't have to worry about now, and get their rickshaws or autos or get their vehicles in order. So there is a difference. There is a relaxed kind of mode to online teaching, and therefore its preparation. So we have time to ponder on it. I want to mention something historical here, of historical interest. When America and England, especially America, adopted progressive education, they did it because they were at the brink of introducing mass education in their societies. And they knew that the old-fashioned elite education, which stressed the classics and languages and so on, was not going to work. So now this new kind of education, which was going to have a little more focus on the individual child, no matter what kind of a child, was what was accepted and welcomed. So that was one particular circumstance in their history which made for an educational change. And the second one was for the Americans, when, because of the Sputnik launch by the Soviet Union, they had to do some self-reflection, and they realized that many of the practices had become distortions, practices in the classrooms of the ideals of progressive education, and they were not being of service to their children or themselves as a society. So in a similar mold, may we not look on this present crisis as maybe an opportunity to use it as a turning point for Indian education? As I said, we have a little more time than usual. We have the challenge of teaching diverse kinds of children. We should have that challenge. I know many schools are very uniform in their student body. And if they pander to other kinds of students, they do it in incorrect way by separating them. But if the school is integrated at all, then there is a diversity and they should discover that diversity. This is an opportunity to be much more in touch with the family, something that's going to be the topic of a whole another lecture. But you have to start using, by you I mean teachers, I'm presuming some of the audience here consists of teachers. We have to be much more accepting of the fact that the parents of our students are going to be our mediators. They're going to be sort of assistants or aides for us, simply because the child is now located at home and in the family. Now, this parent might not be very educated. They're not in tune with our thinking and our philosophy, and they might even be illiterate. So here's a real opportunity to come to terms with what our society is. Our society is one of terrific social difference. And if we are going to pretend that it is not, and we are going to avoid confronting that reality, then we are not really modern. We are not modern anyway, but modernity is only as modern as the least modern of our fellow citizens. And if we are going to ignore that, shut ourselves up in a bubble of some kind and say those people, they can't do this, they have this problem, etc., then that's going to be redundant for us. We are not going to get anywhere. It is a real opportunity for us to rethink the way we tackle difference and diversity in our society. And there are lots and lots of creative ways to do it. We work in our school with families very closely and guardians and so on. So I could talk separately about some of those ways, but one quick thing I'll mention is parents' workshops. Typically, in an average school, the contact that the school has with parents is only at the parent-teachers meetings, where it's pretty much one-sided, and the school is telling the parents how the students are doing and how they should be doing and what the parents should do next with them and so on. A series of warnings of different kinds. But a parents' workshop, as we conceive of it, consists of very specific topics regarding the use of space and time at home, or of disciplining or technology, the phone, the internet, the television, and so on, and try to, quote unquote, educate the parents in some of the ideas which the school obviously, quite rightly, has. And parents have other preoccupations. They may not have those. It's very important at this point in time to not leapfrog this step and to keep talking, address the children directly and keep talking to them, disregarding the fact that they're all sitting at home surrounded by family members. Instead of that, we have to confront it head on. Again, a topic for next time. So the final thing I want to say today is that, yes, it seems to be that earlier the problem for government schools was how to entice children to come to school. And the children were being offered free lunches, uniforms, books. Now it would seem that for those kinds of children, you'd have to give them, I don't know what, an internet pack, a notepad of some kind. Otherwise, the difference between these who have no access to education and middle-class children who have laptops and internet at home is going to become huge. It's going to become unbelievable. So it's important to remember that, to address it head on. And for those middle-class children and the teachers who are addressing them, it's very important to remember that we are still the teachers, we are still the experts. We are the ones who have spent years and tons of energy and passion in trying to master this area of childhood, children, learning, teaching, and so on. It's not people who are making software. It's not people who are now developing websites. And it's not people, and these are all global companies sometimes, with no expertise in education. We teachers must not cede the ground to them. We must not just take their work and use it unquestioningly. And this applies to the biggest kind of product that they offer, as well as to the smallest image which we find and copy for our own use. We have to be very aware of this. And I'm afraid that many people in India, instead of being exploratory, research-oriented, and looking at our own history, society, traditions, culture, etc., are very happy to open the internet and copy and paste anything that they can find. This is truly a danger. And if there is one danger for children without access, this is a very big danger to those with access. I look forward very much to your questions. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Hi, Neeta ma'am. We have 2 questions that have come in. So the first one is by Jyoti. She's asking if you can elaborate a bit more on the post-colonial curriculum. An example would be helpful to understand what it really means. And should I also tell you the next questions?
Yeah, tell me 2 or 3.
So 2 more questions. The second one is by Varun. What is the body of knowledge for post-colonial curriculum and for classical curriculum? And the third one is by Uma Sudhir. How do you bring in the peer learning that takes place in a normal classroom? How do you replicate it in an online class? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ria. Let me take the first 2 because they're both to do with the nature of curriculum. Post-colonialism is a kind of philosophy. I should not have used the word curriculum because, and I also tried to say that it's in the making. It's not as if there are publications on the subject or anything like that. And partly it's coined in our own school and in our own research center. I'm a historian, and in the discipline of history, as well as many allied disciplines, there is a whole approach called post-colonialism. It's a methodology. And according to that, you pay a lot of attention to the marginalized, to those who are rendered invisible or peripheral, who are left out of the telling of grand narratives in history, who are not represented sufficiently. So it might mean tribals and villagers. It does mean women much of the time. In our understanding, it means children also. Children's views, children's worlds are not properly represented in almost any kind of narrative which we have of society. So although technically it refers to going beyond the kind of divisions that were produced by colonialism. So as you know, when we were colonized by Britain, there was a quasi-racial or a directly racial kind of division between those who ruled, who were white and British, and those who were ruled, no matter what they thought of themselves. They were all in another category altogether, and they were people of color. So this kind of division, which is based on race, is one kind, but it's exactly parallel and similar to the division that we Indians practice in our own society on our own selves. We are all one race. And yet we often act, speak, talk, and behave as if we were divided up into different kinds of people. And to overcome by understanding this, the history of it and the logistics of it and the politics of it, to overcome that is what I mean by post-colonial. So it's first an exercise that the teacher has to conduct on herself by understanding her own history and society and where she is placed in that, by confronting head-on matters of gender, class, caste, community, and then discover ways to teach it and convey it to the children at different levels according to whom she teaches. So that's what I mean by a post-colonial philosophy on which could be based a post-colonial curriculum. What is the body of knowledge for the classical curriculum? Well, it's the body of knowledge taught by examined by the ICSE and CBSE boards, right? Whatever is taken as predefined, that this is what history, geography, literature, economics, etc., must consist of. These are the great authors. This is the canon, right? This is what you must read. This is what you must know. That is what is the classical curriculum. And the third question was about peer learning. I would love to know more about that from people's own experiences. I don't think our school's experience has been particularly productive in this. I think that it's not actually reasonable to expect for children after participating in a whole class of 50 minutes or so, and many classes like that in a day, in a weekday, to then engage in discussion with each other or exchange of materials all online. I think that for a few things, we have to recognize that there will be a post-COVID-19 time, that not everything can be done online, and that for some things, we have to just plan how to make up for what we have lost time with and do it in that time.
Thank you so much. I'll just go on with the next few questions. I'll club a few questions which are of similar theme. First is by Vikas. If you can elaborate upon the valid philosophies, the idea of valid philosophies that you have written in your concept note. So more about that. The next question is by Rhythm about elaborating on the relationship between rote learning, progressive child-centered education that you were mentioning. So how are those two connected? And the next question is something similar that what Madhu and Dr. Gaurav have spoken about addressing the issue of inequity in the access to online education, because many students have access, many don't. So in a neoliberal state, how can anything be achieved without the help of the state?
Thank you. So,
yeah.
You know how it happens. You write a concept note and then you move on to write the lecture itself. So I'm not sure what the valid philosophies are that I had in mind, except for the 3 or 4 I've mentioned. You know, and I did mention the classical one or idealistic one, the progressive one or the developmental one, and then our own, the post-colonial one. But the first two are the absolutely overarching main philosophies of education, and almost everything fits in there, even though there are variations. And what I was saying is that every school has one or more of a combination of these philosophies. It's just that they are not clear or articulate about it. So it's a good exercise to think, what is our definition of valid knowledge? What is our idea of the learning to impart to children? What do we base it on? What is our notion of the child? Do we think of the child as an individual? Do we think of learning as pre-packaged? Do we think of certain concepts or ideas as age-old and truthful, no matter what happens historically and so on? So those are the kinds of ideas that imbibe a philosophy and are part of your philosophy, whatever it is of education. Rhythm. Are you the same Rhythm who went to our school? Rote versus progressive teaching. This is a question for teachers specifically, if I might say so. I know it can be of interest to everyone, but teachers often have this dilemma. I know that our teachers have it. So once again, let me, with the permission of my teachers, some of whom are present, use us as an example. In our case, there is sometimes a kind of wavering. What should we do? What should we do? How much of this? How much of that? We instinctively think that rote learning is bad, although all of us who are successful in our lives are products of having mastered a lot of things by heart. We all. I went to what I would consider to be the premier girls' school in North India. Hello to any Loretoites out there. It's called Loreto Convent, Lucknow. And in Loreto, we learned by rote everything, including every history lesson, the whole play, 12th Night by Shakespeare. Did it injure me or harm me in any way? Yeah, maybe for a few years. I was left out of many creative things that I might have been interested in. But in the long run, it gave only power and more power. I could handle all kinds of things. And after you have mastered a certain core thing, it's possible to go on both to qualify that, modify that in different ways, to question it, to overcome it, to produce more and create more. So I think that rote learning is valuable. It has been dismissed without reflection only because it seems old-fashioned. And in the case of the West, it seems to characterize things like studying the Vedas and studying the Quran. And the irony is that it actually characterizes studying English starting from the middle of the 19th century, when English was first introduced. Anyway, your question was about how rote learning and progressive education can merge. And my point is that they can come together by both being creative. Both could be actually very dull and mechanical and problematic and very negative from the perspective of the child. But both could be extremely creative, performative, fulfilling, and therefore good, positive things. About inequity, we work in the villages. We work with very, very poor children of the cities and of some villages. We also have in our student body some very elite people, very progressive people, upper middle class people, aristocratic people, people with a lot of wealth and power. So we have inequity as a fact and a characteristic of our society reflected in our student body. Can we do anything with it if the government does not intervene? Of course not. No one can do anything privately of the measure that can be undertaken by the government. I just want to mention that I am aware that Azim Premji University and Azim Premji Foundation took up this very issue, and they wanted very purposefully to work with the government schools. And I think that's what should be done. Ours is a private school. And I have always been in a quandary about it. It can serve as a model. It can serve as an experiment or a lab. And I learn a whole lot from it. And hopefully it can teach others many important things. But the point is that the real change can only be brought about by the government through government schools. Think of the statistics. Think of the number of children that we are talking about who are not in elite schools and private schools. So I just recently heard that Kerala had taken a very interesting step, and they had made classes available on state TV. That seems like a perfectly simple and doable thing for a government to do.
Sorry. Thank you, ma'am. A few more questions, but before that, when you spoke about access and equity and peer learning, the question about peer learning. So Lakshmi has shared her example that they did try to get children to exchange stories between themselves, but it was difficult. However, they used WhatsApp groups and children did interact a lot amongst themselves on chat and voice notes. So that is a very similar resonating experience to our school as well. I'll move on to the next set of questions. These are connected to the access and inequity. One is that One is by Priya ma'am, that are we looking at the curriculum that we want to engage with as being challenged by technology today? Is the curriculum that weak, that, is technology challenging our curriculum? Secondly, even if all families had access to technology, are we confident that children are engaged deeply or critically with the curriculum that is being offered to them? And a similar question was also being asked by Tanya, where she said that what about addressing the adaptability struggles students are facing when we shift from face to face to an online mode? So that is one question.
You should stop, Priya. I'll forget them.
All right. Okay, fine.
And I still might need you to remind me. So the first one was about the sharing of stories. And I agree. Thank you for that example from your own case. I just mean that such cases are relatively rare, but of course they exist. And what I also didn't mention as a very positive thing about present online learning is how some children have a newfound sense of importance. They have suddenly a one-to-one kind of line with their teachers. They feel that they are being given more attention, and they of course have possession of the device for a certain time, and the fun of that, the pleasure of that. It may not be long lasting, but it has proved very useful to their learning. Should we look at technology as a challenge, Priya? Yeah. So I think it's too early. If you're afraid of it, it's a good thing to be afraid and to worry about it and to think how much we want to be led by it and how much we want to lead that change which will occur through technology. I think what will happen is that after these COVID-19 times, firstly, we'll all relax and we'll go back to our old kind of teaching very happily. But at the same time, we will have included now irreversibly a certain amount of reliance on the internet and so on, which will be irreversible. So we are in a position right now, we are at the crossroads, as I like to put it, where we could decide to be the leaders and the people who, because of our own expertise in this, are able to use technology in the ways that we think best. Or are we going to be led by it? Because it's a huge world out there of people who are only the masters in technology and who actually, please excuse me if there are any among the audience who are like that, who actually have expertise on everything else but education, but feel free to dabble in education, thinking it's just one more area of work. And they may have never given a thought to what is childhood or children. They may have never touched any resource that belongs to children. And therefore, what they would come up with in terms of their product, technologically speaking, might seem very impressive in terms of its medium, its genre, but the content would be very problematic. So I think there is a hidden threat or a challenge there, but I think it's not at all too late, by far. We have just about begun this journey. It's up to us which way we can take it and which way it will go. Remind me of the third question, Ria, please. The children's...
Yeah, just the adaptability of students of when we shift from face-to-face teaching to online teaching. So are they even ready, even if they have access, are they ready to critically engage with all the curriculum that is being given to them?
Well, if my 2.5-year-old granddaughter is any evidence, any child is ready to shift at any time. All children are much faster than adults and much more adaptable. And the children I interact with, they are there, they're reminding me, they're pushing ahead, they're typing away stuff, they're responding and so on. Now, having said that, I have to add that, of course, it's the support structure that matters. Children are not free, they're not like adults, they can't control their resources, they can't even control time. Even the smartest or the most what should I say, resourced of them doesn't have that kind of freedom or power. And ultimately, they're controlled by their parents or their families. So their adaptability intellectually and cognitively is immense. We need to have no worries about that. But in terms of the actual availability to them of time, support, and the devices that they need, there is a big question mark, and we can't answer that. We just have to find out more. In each case, each school has to find out more about the families that they are dealing with.
All right. The next set of questions, last three questions are, first one was by Nivedita about inclusion. How can inclusion be a part of COVID-19 scenario? I think you've said something about it, but if you'd like to add something more. Uma has asked if you are, she's asking for a clarification, if you mean that rote learning is the same as mastery. And the last question is that what are the few things that we should be mindful about when we are, embarking on online teaching?
Yeah, so in terms of inclusion, there was a time we all thought it was very funny when cell phones had started. And I remember hearing things like, maybe it was in an ad or whatever, that even the milkman and the peanut seller and everyone has a cell phone, right? So suddenly everyone was equal. And the cell phone was being touted as a great object of producing equality in a society. And for girls, it was being, presented as something that will suddenly give them freedom and equality. And then appeared smartphones, and suddenly the world is very unequal again, because lots and lots of people have cell phones, but they can't do much with it. And you do need to spend. Every moment costs money. Everything you download costs money. I know there are infinite and limitless packs and whatever, but the problem of inequity, and therefore the problem of inclusivity, is a huge one that really demands very, very particular, careful study. I hope a lot of research is being done as we speak. We at our end are busy doing it, and I certainly am. And we need to find out how exactly we could use this present time to make education more inclusive. I think what I found is that it's unpredictable. You would have guessed that certain students would be much further behind than they are, and certain students would be more advanced than they are. But the usual kind of balance in a classroom is a little upset. And children who could not handle classroom teaching are suddenly forging ahead with online teaching, and vice versa. So it's not very clear. It's all very anecdotal, and that's the best I can do right now. Thank you for the rote learning question. I think maybe I was being a little fuzzy, but I meant actually rote learning. That's why I mentioned the Vedas and the Quran, which have to be learned completely by rote. And how many things there are, we don't even acknowledge it. But even the alphabets, even the numbers, even the names of colors, I mean, face it, these are not open to negotiation. The verbs, I mean, none of this is. You're not going to let a child handle all these things at their level. And as soon as the child makes some 2 + 2 = 5 kind of jump of the imagination, you're not going to say, well, that's wonderful. I can see that you're full of imagination and you're really trying very hard, and kudos to you. That's not going to happen. They have to learn what is what. And it's all, as far as I'm concerned, the skills that have to be mastered. So you're completely right. It's like a spectrum. On the one hand, there are already bodies of knowledge that you have to completely learn by heart or by rote. And then there are other things which you have to figure out step by step and master. But at the end of the day, you've still learned it by heart. The third question, please remind me again.
Yes, just a minute. So yeah, last question. I think I would like to club two questions again. This would be the last one. The first one was that what are the few things that we should keep in mind when we are embarking on online education, online learning now, online teaching? And the second one was that it would be interesting to know your thoughts about dealing with difference and diversity and how that could be translated into an online setting. This question is put up by Adriana. She's our parent at the school. And which seems so difficult to do, particularly for younger children, when they do not have the chance to physically socialize with their peers. So yeah, that would be the last question.
So let me answer that one first, because it's something very dear to my heart. And one of the things actually about this developmental approach on which some aspects of progressive education are based, and especially which was very popularized by John Dewey in the US, is that you have to proceed step by step, especially in social studies, from teaching about yourself, the child, and the family, and their identity, and the community, and the neighborhood, and then move out into a wider sphere. Because there are these stages, as Piaget said for maths and so on, but he said for the humanities, there are these stages that from the simple to the complex that children evolve in. And the truth is that children actually are not simple when they are small, and they do not evolve into complexity. They're amazingly complex when they're small. And we as adults have much more to deal with and cope with in understanding, tolerating, and therefore handling diversity and difference than children do. Children's fairy tales, for instance, are full of ogres and witches and crazy creatures, and also all kinds of creatures. So one thing you could do technically is just expose them to more and more of these kinds of stories. Look at fantasy, look at fiction, look at fairy tales. Don't lecture them on it. Don't point out what's happening. They get it without your having to meta-narrate it. But the fact that they will find it fascinating to like this kind of a creature is enough, because real life is diverse, but its representation in literature, especially for children, is also very, very well done, and for every age. So go ahead and read your child a lot of stories and tell them a lot of stories and invite them to look around them for parallels. They'll find them. Child. Sorry, I did miss the first question.
The last one being that what are a few things, you've already covered a lot of it, but if there's anything more about a few things that we should keep in mind when we embark on online education.
Yeah, I think that, we as teachers are going to be so preoccupied with devising our own planning and our own curriculum and our lessons, we are going to forget that children have a lot to cope with. So one thing to keep in mind is a kind of division, to give a lot of attention to the child, just to warm up the sessions by asking about themselves and what are they experiencing, what are they doing, how are they coping, what are they feeling, etc. This doesn't have to take up a lot of time. You can ask them to write a journal. Journals are great things. So go ahead and write journals.
Thank you so much, Neeta ma'am. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and for very interesting questions. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you did too. As I said in the beginning of my talk, that we have started a fundraiser to continue our efforts like such talks, our schools, our online classes, supporting our staff members. I am sharing the link to our Milap fundraiser in the chat box. Please consider donating in your capacity. And thank you so much for joining us today. We will be sharing a post-talk email with a feedback form, as well as the video lecture uploaded on YouTube with all of you. A few notes about the lecture will also be shared that have been taken by one of our teachers. You can have a look at the email, and if you have any more questions, please feel free to shoot it to me. My email ID is with all of y'all anyway. Thank you so much for coming. Bye.